The wind howled like a living thing, its icy fingers clawing at the barren treetops as the first flakes of snow began to fall. The air was sharp, biting, and carried the promise of something much worse. Overhead, the sky churned with dark, oppressive clouds, the kind that signaled a storm of unusual ferocity. It was coming, and it was bringing with it a chill that could freeze the breath in a man's lungs. The German team moved through the forest with practiced efficiency, their figures blending into the grays and whites of the landscape. They spoke in low murmurs, their German precise and clipped, the words barely audible over the rising wind.
Die Temperatur sinkt schneller, als ich erwartet habe.
One of the men muttered, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his face. The German leader glanced back at him, his expression stern but calm.
Weitergehen,
he said sharply, his voice cutting through the cold like a blade. The group pressed forward, their boots crunching in the snow. The forest around them seemed to grow darker with each passing minute, the dense canopy above swallowing what little light remained. It was as though the world itself was closing in, drawing them into its icy grip. The first real gust of the storm hit them like a wall, forcing the men to lean into it as they trudged forward. Snow whipped around them, stinging their faces and blurring their vision. Alan raised a gloved hand, signaling for a halt. The team clustered together, their breaths visible in the frigid air as they waited for his command.
Wir brauchen Deckung.
One of the men said, his voice tinged with urgency. The German leader nodded, his eyes scanning the terrain. The map they carried was useless now. The storm had erased any landmarks, leaving them with nothing but an endless expanse of white. He pointed to a distant ridge, barely visible through the swirling snow.
Dort.
They moved as one, their bodies hunched against the relentless wind. The climb to the ridge was brutal, the snowdrifts deepening with every step. By the time they reached the top, their muscles burned with exhaustion, and their breaths came in ragged gasps. But the sight that greeted them was well worth the effort. Below the ridge, nestled among the trees, was the faint outline of a structure. It was medium and unassuming, but it was shelter. The German leader allowed himself a brief moment of relief before gesturing for his men to follow. They descended the ridge cautiously, their movements deliberate as they approached the building. The structure was a sort of bunker or small command outpost, its concrete walls partially buried in the snow. It looked old, abandoned, but it was intact, a rare find in this desolate wilderness. The leader approached the door, his hand resting on the cold metal handle. He glanced back at his team, his expression flat.
Bereit?
He asked quietly. The men nodded, their weapons at the ready. The German leader pushed the door open, the heavy metal groaning in protest. The air inside was stale and cold, but it was a welcome reprieve from the storm. The group filed in quickly, their boots echoing on the concrete floor. The bunker was medium-sized, its walls lined with mostly empty shelves and rusted equipment. A single table stood in the center of the room, surrounded by mismatched chairs. It was clear that no one had been here for a long time. Their leader closed the door behind them, shutting out the storm's roar, and turned to his men.
Seht euch
The team spread out, their movements precise as they searched the bunker. One of the men found a dusty pile of firewood in a corner, along with an old stove that, miraculously, still appeared functional. Another discovered a few cans of food, their labels faded but intact.
Das wird uns nicht lange halten.
One of them remarked, holding up the meager rations. The German nodded grimly.
Es reicht für heute Nacht.
They set to work quickly, lighting the stove and rationing the food. The warmth from the fire was a welcome comfort, though it did little to chase away the cold that had settled deep in their bones. The men ate in silence, their expressions somber as the storm raged outside. As night fell, the storm grew even fiercer. The wind screamed against the walls of the bunker, freezing the structure with every gust. Snow piled up against the door, beginning to seal them in. The men huddled close to the stove, their faces illuminated by its flickering light. The leader sat apart from the group, his back against the wall, his rifle resting across his knees. His eyes were fixed on the fire, his thoughts unreadable. He could feel the weight of the storm pressing down on them, a relentless force that seemed determined to crush them.
Wie lange denkst du, wird es dauern?
One of the men asked, breaking the silence. The German leader didn't look up.
Zu lang.
The answer was met with a heavy silence. They all knew the truth. The storm wasn't just a passing squall, it was a monster. A super blizzard that showed no signs of relenting. They were trapped, at the mercy of the elements. Despite the dire situation, the men began to settle in. The fire provided a small measure of comfort, and the shelter of the bunker shielded them from the storm's worst fury, the wind. But the tension remained, an unspoken weight that hung over them like the storm clouds outside. Then suddenly, a sound cut through the storm. A faint crunch, like snow being displaced. The German leader's head snapped toward the door, his hand instinctively tightening around his rifle. The others froze, their bodies tense, eyes darting to their leader for guidance.
Habt ihr das gehört?
The leader nodded sharply, signaling for silence. The team stood, their movements slow and deliberate as they readied their weapons. The faint sound grew louder, a rhythmic crunching of boots against snow, accompanied by muffled voices. Whoever it was, they were getting closer. The heavy metal door creaked as the approaching group pushed it open. Snow and wind rushed into the room, sending the flames of the stove flickering wildly. Through the swirling cold stepped a figure in British uniform, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his posture tense but deliberate. Behind him, several more figures followed, their faces half hidden by scarves and snow. For a long moment, the two groups hollered at each other, their shouts overlapping in a cacophony of German and English commands. Weapons were cocked and aimed, trembling fingers hovering over triggers. The confined space amplified every sound, the sharp echoes of shouted commands and curses reverberating off the cold concrete walls.
Drop your fucking weapons!
Shouted the British officers, their voices cutting through the chaos as their team took defensive positions near the door. The German leader barked back, his commands sharp and unyielding. The two groups stood frozen, each side unwilling to be the first to back down, their eyes darting between faces and barrels, assessing every twitch and movement.
Legt eure Waffen nieder.
The storm outside roared like a furious beast, the wind slamming against the bunker as if to add its voice to the confrontation. The leader of the Germans, his adrenaline flooding as he took in the scene. His men were cornered, their rifles aimed but their bodies stiff with the tension of a situation spiraling out of control.
You're surrounded!
The British officer called again, his eyes darting between the German leader and his men.
Stand down and no one gets hurt.
The German's jaw tightened. His voice came low and calm but edged with authority.
You came into our shelter and you think we're surrounded?
He said in German accented English, his rifle unwavering. For a moment the room was filled with nothing but the storm's distant howl and the collective sound of heavy, measured breathing. Then, slowly, the British officer raised a hand, a gesture for his men to hold. The German mirrored the action, signaling his own team to steady themselves, though their weapons remained ready.
All right, let's not try to kill each other in here. Not while that storm's out there. Because I sure as hell don't see any medics here, It'd be a bloody mess in here if we were to shoot each other up. Men screaming in pain, calling for their mothers. Fucking wankers dying because of something stupid.
The British officer said at last, his tone firm but no longer shouting. The room remained silent for a moment longer, the storm's distant roar the only sound. As the storm thrashed on outside, the two groups waited in the uneasy quiet of the bunker, their shared predicament seemingly forcing them into a tenuous coexistence. The German's eyes flicked to the door where the wind screamed against the bunker's walls. It was a harsh reminder of the unforgiving conditions outside. Finally, after a tense moment that felt like an eternity, he gave a small nod.
Agreed.
He said, his voice measured.
For now.
Then, slowly, both sides began to lower their weapons, not fully, but enough to diffuse the immediate tension. The truce was fragile, a thread stretched taut between survival and mistrust. The two groups remained rigid, their eyes darting warily between one another as they shifted uneasily in the confined space. The fragile truce was more out of necessity than trust, the storm outside binding them to the bunker. as their only refuge.